The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provision agenda for the meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, conflict, and food security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Gabriela Bucher, Executive Director, Oxfam International. Mr. David Beasley, Executive Director of the World Food Program. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2021/217, a letter dated 3 March 2021 from the Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General and the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion.
I have no camera there. Okay.
I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. António Guterres.
Madam President, Excellencies, thank you for this opportunity to brief you on the links between conflict and hunger, an urgent and important issue. And today I have one simple message. If you don't feed people, you feed conflict. Conflict drives hunger and famine drive conflict. When a country or region is gripped by conflict and hunger, they become mutually reinforcing. They cannot be resolved separately. Hunger and poverty combined with inequality, climate shocks, sectarian and ethnic tension, grievances over land and resources to spark and drive conflict. At the same time, conflict forces people to leave their homes, land and jobs, disrupts agriculture and trade, reduces access to vital resources like water and electricity, and so drives hunger. The Nobel Committee recognized this link when it awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to the World Food Program, a powerful call to action recognizing the importance of food security to building peace and stability. We have made enormous inroads into hunger over recent decades, thanks to improved productivity and reductions in global poverty. Famine and hunger are no longer about lack of food. They are now largely man-made, and I use the term deliberately. They are concentrated in countries affected by large-scale, protracted conflict, and they are rising. At the end of 2020, more than 88 million people were suffering from acute hunger due to conflict and instability, a 20% increase in 1 year. And projections for 2021 point to a continuation of this frightening trend. I must warn the Council that we face multiple conflict-driven famines around the world. Climate shocks and the COVID-19 pandemic are adding fuel to the flames. Without immediate action, millions of people will reach the brink of extreme hunger and death. Projections show hunger crisis escalating and spreading across the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, and accelerating in South Sudan, Yemen, and Afghanistan. There are more than 30 million people in over 3,000 countries just one step away from a declaration of famine. And women and girls face a double risk. They are more likely to be forced from their homes by conflict, and they are more vulnerable to malnutrition, particularly when pregnant or breastfeeding are relevant. Girls who are angry are at increased risk of trafficking, forced marriage, and other abuses. Food insecurity is worsened by the reduction of humanitarian access. I'm deeply concerned about the situation in Tigray, Ethiopia, where the harvest season has been disrupted by insecurity and violence, and hundreds of thousands of people could be experiencing hunger. Madam President, in some countries, famine is already here. people are dying from hunger and suffering critical rates of malnutrition. Parts of Yemen, South Sudan, and Burkina Faso are in the grip of famine or conditions akin to famine. And more than 150,000 people are at the risk of starving. In Yemen, 5 years of conflict have displaced 4 million people across the country. And many Yemenis are facing a death sentence as widespread hunger stalks their nation. Around half of all children under 5, 2.3 million, are projected to face acute malnutrition in 2021. And some 60 million people face food insecurity. South Sudan is facing its highest levels of food insecurity since the country declared independence 10 years ago. 60% of the population are increasingly hungry. And food prices are so high that just one plate of rice and beans costs more than 180% of the average daily salary, the equivalent of about $400 here in New York. Chronic sporadic violence, extreme weather, and the economic impact of COVID-19 have pushed more than 7 million people into acute food insecurity. The Democratic Republic of the Congo experienced the world's largest food crisis last year, with nearly 21.8 million people facing acute hunger between July and December. The targeting of WFP vehicles in the east of the country last month, and the tragic killing of our colleague Mustafa Milambo, as well as the Italian ambassador Luca Attanasio and the security officer Vittorio Iacovacci, are the starkest possible illustration of the dark alliance between hunger and conflict. Madam President, this is a devastating reality in conflict zones around the world. We have a responsibility to do everything in our power to reverse these trends, starting by preventing famine. Last September, the Secretariat provided a white paper outlining the risks of famine in 4 countries. The situation has only grown more urgent. Hunger and deaths begin long before the highest levels of food insecurity. We must anticipate and act now. I have therefore decided to establish a high-level task force on preventing famine, led by my Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock. This task force will include representatives from the World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization. And it will bring coordinated high-level attention to famine prevention and mobilize support to the most affected countries. I've also asked the Under-Secretary General Lowcock to draw on the support of other interagency standing committee members and obviously including UNICEF, the World Health Organization, UNHCR, the UN Development Programme, UNFPA, and UN Women. And the group will cooperate with the non-governmental organizations who are our vital partners in feeding the hungry around the world. And will also work with international financial institutions and other specialized UN agencies, including the International Fund for Agricultural Development. I urge all members of this council to support the task force in every way possible and to do everything in your power to take urgent action to prevent famine. Madam President, our most serious concern must be the more than 34 million people who already face emergency levels of acute food insecurity. WFP and FAO have appealed for the emergency mobilization of $5.5 billion in extraordinary resources to avert catastrophe for these 34 million women, men, girls, and boys. These resources are needed for a comprehensive package of life-saving aid, including the distribution of food, cash, and vouchers, targeted support for agriculture, and medical treatment for people already suffering from acute malnutrition. All countries face some economic of the COVID-19 pandemic. The solution does not lie in cutting aid to starving children. The disappointing outcome of last week's high-level pledging event on Yemen cannot become a pattern. I ask all countries to reconsider their responsibilities and their capacities. The relatively small amounts of money involved in humanitarian aid are an investment not only in people, but an investment.
Madam President, people suffering from acute hunger must have access to food and vital assistance in full safety, especially during armed conflict. In accordance with Resolution 2417 of this Council and under international humanitarian law, objects that are indispensable to the survival of civilian populations, such as foodstuffs, crops, and livestock, must be protected. Humanitarian access must be unimpeded, and the use of starvation as a weapon of warfare is prohibited. Unfortunately, there is no shortage of recent examples of the use of starvation as a tactic of war. The conflict in Syria subjected millions of civilians to terrible conditions, which in certain cases were tantamount to starvation. In 2017, the famine was declared in certain parts of South Sudan, where humanitarian access was systematically denied the population. And in Myanmar, there is information pointing to hunger due to the destruction of farmland and village, as well as restrictions on movement have been used against the Rohingya. The deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of warfare rises to the level of a war crime. I urge the members of the Council to use all means at their disposal to ensure that those responsible for these heinous acts be held accountable, and to remind parties to the conflicts of their obligations under international humanitarian law.
Addressing hunger is a foundation for stability and peace. We need to tackle both hunger and conflict if we are to solve either. Our blueprint for reducing hunger in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and particularly the Sustainable Development Goal 2 on zero hunger. We need to transform our food systems to make them more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. These will be issues of the Food System Summit that I will convene later this year. At the same time, it requires us to find political solutions to conflict. I urge all states to make ending conflict not simply mitigating its impact a key foreign policy priority. And I call on Council members to use your privileged position to do everything in your power to end violence, negotiate peace, and alleviate the hunger and suffering that afflicts so many millions of people around the world. There is no place for famine and starvation in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General, for your remarks. We understand that the Secretary General will have to leave at 11 a.m. due to another engagement, but I want to thank him really from the bottom of my heart again for his participation in today's meeting. Thank you, sir. I now give the floor to Gabriela Bucher.
Madam President, Secretary General, Excellencies. In 1941, the people of Greece were facing a horrific winter. The Axis powers had plundered local supplies and introduced an extortionate tax on Greek citizens. Allied forces imposed a cruel blockade, cutting off imports. Prices skyrocketed. Hundreds of thousands of civilians perished. I have been invited to address you today as the Executive Director of Oxfam International, an expression of people power that was first launched to stand with the people of Greece to demand their most basic of rights, the right to food in the midst of conflict. I am horrified that we are forced to confront the same basic injustice that gave birth to our founding nearly 80 years ago. Indeed, as we witness blockades cutting off food and fuel to Yemen, millions going hungry in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, and Syria, we should all be horrified. 3 years ago, when this Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2417, we heard an unequivocal condemnation of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. We heard a recognition that peace and security in an armed conflict means the presence of food as much as the absence of gunfire. But is the promise of 2417 being kept? Many of the countries that were at risk of famine from conflict in 2017 are still at risk. And now more countries have joined them. Overall, at least 88 million people are suffering through acute hunger in countries where conflict and insecurity stalks. Women and girls are disproportionately affected, too often eating last and eating least. People in these areas are not starving. They are being starved. It makes little difference to the hungry whether they are being starved by deliberate action or the callous negligence of conflict parties or the international community, an international community whose most powerful states too often drive starvation with a plentiful supply of weapons. Excellencies, I want you to know about Aisha Jaya Daish from Yemen. When her village was bombed, she was forced to flee. Aisha had dreamed of becoming a midwife, but in an economy under attack from all sides, it takes all the energy she has just to survive. Her 2-year-old brother Maidan depends on her, but all she can afford to feed him is a few crumbs in water. Maidan is so malnourished that Aisha believes any exposure to COVID-19 will be fatal. I want you to know about Tesfaye Getachew, a farmer in Tigray regional state in Ethiopia. He has faced blackouts, market and bank closures that have devastated millions, but felt he could rely on the food he grew to feed his family. Last November, his village was shelled and his crops were set on fire, leaving his family with nothing. I want you to know Husseina from the Central African Republic. The country has seen a deadly spike in violence over recent months that has led to insecurity on roads, meaning that food isn't getting to markets. Food prices have skyrocketed by 240% in some areas. Husseina's home and fields were destroyed in the fighting. With support from Oxfam, she replanted crops, only to see them destroyed again in the recent fighting. My pain was immense, she said. I don't know how to feed my family. We ate almost exclusively the vegetables that I grow. Excellencies, women like Husseina want you to live up to your basic promise to keep their families safe. She and her fellow farmers are more than capable of producing enough food to feed their families, but they cannot do so in the face of violence. Women in conflict face impossible choices: to travel to market and risk crossing checkpoints, or to watch their families go hungry, to harvest their crops and risk being attacked, or to stay and face starvation. Sometimes they have no choice. Sahar, 3, and her sister Hanan, 8, were displaced by the conflict in Yemen and forced to marry because their parents said they could not feed them. I'm here to amplify their call to the Security Council to make good on its unanimous agreement to break the vicious cycle of conflict and food insecurity. How? We have 5 points. First, the Council could deepen its work on this topic with a clear commitment for action. It should agree on a depoliticized criteria facilitating the regular, mandatory reporting on situations when there is a risk of conflict-induced famine or food insecurity. It should undertake quarterly reviews of action on the white papers considered under the early warning system. Second, the Council must take genuine action to support the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, urgently, ensuring humanitarian access, ensuring the inclusion of women from the beginning of the process. It took 4 months for this Council to support the initial call for a ceasefire. People on the edge of starvation do not have the time to wait for another year for action. Third, the Council should apply the principles have endorsed in the abstract to the particular situations on its agenda. It should impartially condemn the starvations of civilians as a weapon of war, the targeting of critical food infrastructure, and all restrictions on humanitarian access. It should also take any opportunity to create meaningful accountability for starvation crimes. Today, there is near global impunity. Fourth, it should endorse and its members should lead the effort to fulfill the global appeal for $5.5 billion to meet additional needs to avert famine, most especially in light of COVID-19. To be most effective, this aid must flow as directly and urgently as possible to local organizations, especially women-led and women's rights organizations, which are on the front line in addressing hunger. And fifth, it should endorse a people's vaccine for COVID-19 that is free and accessible to all. Ending this pandemic will not end hunger, but we won't end hunger if we cannot end this pandemic. Rich nations must unlock global supply constraints and help get the vaccine to all who need it. Our failure to address hunger before the COVID crisis and the rampant inequality and climate change, which has so often triggered conflict, has left us scrambling to avert famine across the globe. Let us be clear. Starvation is a symptom of a deeper problem. The growing crisis of starvation is taking place in a world where 8 of the biggest food and drink companies paid over $18 billion to shareholders last year. Those dividends alone are more than 3 times what we are asking for in aid today to avert catastrophe. There is no lack of food. There is a lack of equality. I know this from my own experience. Growing up in Colombia, life in conflict was all we knew. Millions of people were forcibly displaced and lost their land and livelihoods, condemned to hunger, while others, often streets away, led very different lives because they were lucky to live in privilege, not poverty. Excellencies, there is an unnerving consistency in what people living through hunger and conflict around the world tell us they want. They want peace. But what does peace mean to them? Peace is just not the absence of war, but the ability to live in dignity and to flourish. It means a job, a return home, stable, affordable food prices. If the Security Council aims to foster peace in their name, it should be no less expansive in their perspective and its actions. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bucher, for your briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. David Beasley.
Madam President, Secretary General, I hope that someday I can appear to the Security Council with some good news, and this is not one of those days of good news. I remember about a year ago when we appeared before on this particular topic with regards to pandemics around the world, and the world was still getting to grips with the novel COVID-19 virus, and I addressed the Security Council and warned them that the world stood literally on the brink of 2 pandemics, a health COVID pandemic, and due to its economic impact and supply chain disruption, a hunger pandemic. I said, if we're not careful how we address COVID, the cure could very well be much worse than the disease itself. And so armed conflict, compounded by climate extremes and the COVID-19 pandemic, has threatened to push the number of people in the world marching to the brink of starvation from 135 million people pre-COVID a year ago to 270 million people that we're looking at now. And back then, if you recall, I warned famines of biblical proportion were a real and a terrifying prospect in over 36 countries. And thankfully, the world listened. Leaders responded around the world with economic stimulus packages, deferred debt for low and middle income countries, safety net programs, etc., that were implemented. And as a result, we globally averted a catastrophe. And I'm proud and sad at the same time that last year, the World Food Program reached 114 million people with life-saving assistance, the highest annual total in our history. In 2020, we thought that by the end of the year and by 2021 that COVID would be behind us and that the economies and systems would be surging back to normal. And unfortunately, new waves of COVID have been unrelenting, and the concerns of 2020 are now a reality for 2021. So today I must warn you. Hold on, let's see, we got an error here. So today, must warn you, I apologize for this. I've had an internet problem here.
David,
so today I must warn you. Yeah, I had a problem there for a minute. I don't know what it was, but anyway, Madam President, thank you. So I want to warn you, here we are today knocking literally on famine and the abyss. So while COVID is undeniably exacerbated fragility around the world, man-made conflict is driving instability and powering a destructive new wave of famine that threatens to sweep across the world. The toll being paid in human misery is unimaginable. So I want to thank the Secretary General for his leadership in trying to avert these famines. WFP's food insecurity projections for 2021 are truly shocking. Take, for example, the DRC, where I was last week. It's one of the world's forgotten conflicts. But this year, it's set to become the world's largest hunger emergency, with 19.6 million people facing crisis, emergency, or catastrophic levels of food insecurity. That's up from 15.6 million people a year ago. Afghanistan, this number is now 17 million people, up from 13.9 million people. Nigeria is 13 million, a staggering increase from 5 million people. In Syria, over 12 million people face crisis levels of food insecurity or worse, an all-time high, and up from 9.3 million people. Sudan, South Sudan, the Sahel, and I could go on and on and on. Dozens of countries with millions of their children going hungry because armed groups won't lay down their guns. Now, 270 million people are facing a hunger crisis. And as the Secretary General laid out so clearly, famine is a dangerous possibility in over 30 countries. WFP estimates that at least 34 million people are knocking on the door of famine. These looming famines have two things in common. They are primarily driven by conflict, and they are entirely preventable. With modern forecasting, improved agricultural practices, and effective humanitarian organizations, natural disasters are no longer plunge populations into famine. But make no mistake about it, man-made conflict is the real culprit. Displacement, a major consequence of armed violence. Means lives are turned upside down, fields are abandoned, harvests are missed, and families are forced from their lands, become dependent on humanitarian assistance just to meet their basic needs. The cycle of violence, hunger, and despair pulls in more and more individuals and families as the weeks and months pass. But the potential consequences are truly global: economic deterioration, destabilization, mass migration, and starvation. In recent days, I've seen the suffering inflicted on innocent families caught in the crossfire of these conflicts. Just 2 days ago, I was in Yemen, where over 16 million people now face crisis levels of hunger or worse. These aren't just numbers. These are real people. And we're headed toward the biggest famine in modern history. It is hell on earth in many places in Yemen right now. I visited, again, just 2 days ago, the Al Sabeen Children's Hospital in Sana'a. While overwhelmingly I found stories of horror, there were a few rare stories of hope. But most are stories of pain and hardship. Almost all of the children I met were sick, skin and bones, and dying with entirely preventable or treatable illnesses. If I showed you some of the pictures, you would not believe it, and no one with a heart at all could sit idly by and let this continue. No one. And what's really sad is that these are the fortunate ones, because they are actually receiving medical help. I asked one of the doctors how many beds they have, and she told me 25. And I said, well, what about the children you have to turn away? Well, what happens to them? And she replied, they go home to die. And understand, this is at the best hospital. Around 400,000 children may die in Yemen this year without urgent intervention. That is roughly a child every 75 seconds. So while we're sitting here, every minute and a quarter, a child's dying. Are we really going to turn our backs on them and look the other way? Like a 5-month-old little girl shows you. I was in her room 2 days ago where she was lying in the arms of her mother on the verge of death, and I talked with her mother, who told me that in desperation, she had sold the only canister of cooking gas she had so that she could pay for the day's journey to the hospital to get help for her daughter. Well, I hate to tell you, but an hour and a half ago, she died. And what about all the other families going through this hell? What they have sold what? Only to be denied care when they arrive because of the lack of beds? And now to add to all of their misery, the innocent people of Yemen have to deal with a fuel blockage, a fuel blockade. For example, most hospitals only have electricity in their intensive care units because fuel reserves are so low. I know this firsthand because I walked in the hospital and the lights were off, electricity was off. The people of Yemen deserve our help. That blockade must be lifted as a humanitarian act. Otherwise, millions more will spiral into crisis. And bottom line on Yemen, we need money, lots of it. And above all, we need the war to end. Madam President, sadly, other nations bear similar scars from conflict and instability. During my visit to DRC last week, I met many desperate families. It's cruel irony that this country remains one of the poorest on earth despite all of its vast natural resources. DRC's history of conflict and displacement combined with economic and political instability and health crises such as Ebola have fueled surging food insecurity, as the Secretary General talked about. And WFP's, our food is providing a lifeline to many of these people, preventing them from being overwhelmed by starvation and famine. But we urgently need more funding to continue this work. In February, I was in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, which has been convulsed by armed conflict in recent months. And as you all know, from the humanitarian perspective, everyone has been gravely concerned about getting access to those in need. I, along with other UN leaders, have visited Ethiopia several times since hostilities broke out, including last week and just a few days ago. And after detailed, extensive negotiations with the government, we have achieved some significant breakthroughs. We have substantially improved access for humanitarian workers and cargo in the region, with the United Nations agencies and NGOs being able to deliver more support to those in need. Also, the UN now has satellite dishes working. 2 new ones were approved for IOM just yesterday. They will be available for NGOs to use in Shura and Mekelle. But I'm hopeful that in the next day or so, humanitarians will have additional approval for much needed satellite phones and communications equipment. But the real work is only just beginning. We believe that 3 million people or more in the Tigray region require food assistance. So we have a great deal more to do, but we can't get on with it unless we receive the funding urgently needed. Tragically, the list of countries in need, the casualties of conflict just go on and on. And Madam President, finally, I want to highlight the continuing crisis in South Sudan, where 7.2 million people face acute levels of food insecurity or worse. In early February, I visited Western Pibor and other regions, but in recent days, I've heard of heart-rending stories about the plight of people living in the area. In Western Pibor, for example, in extreme circumstances, mothers are resorting to feeding their children with the skin of dead animals or even mud. Can you imagine? This is a desperate situation that calls for urgent attention. Famine-like conditions have been identified in Western Pibor. The local population called 2021 the year of starvation, and their suffering is a result of widespread conflict and the unprecedented floods that came in 2019 and 2020. These people are in the crossfire of conflict while bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, just like vulnerable communities all around the world. So when we asked the Security Council members to provide $5.5 billion immediately to avoid multiple famines around the world, I urge you to open up your hearts, show compassion, and to give generously. Together, we will use these funds to provide emergency assistance to save millions of lives, protect the livelihoods of the world's poorest communities. But we need all of us to work together. We've got a lot of work to do. Beyond the immediate crisis, we also need to invest in peace so that in the future, desperate families are not forced to the brink of survival by the bullet and the bomb. The costs of this violence are immense. Just in 2019, $14.5 trillion a year. That's 15% of the global GDP. It would take just a fraction of this money to fund the development programs that could transform the lives of people in fragile, conflict-scarred nations and help lay new pathways to peace. The Security Council has a moral obligation to do everything in your power to end these wars. But until we can achieve that, we need you to give us the funds to stop millions of people from dying from starvation. We were able to avert famine in 2020, and we can do it again. Please, don't ask us at the World Food Program to choose which starving child lives and which one dies. Let's feed them all. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Beasley for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of the United States of America and member of President Biden's cabinet. Thank you, Secretary General Guterres, Executive Director Beasley, and Executive Director Bucher for your powerful advocacy to alleviate the scourge of conflict-induced hunger. And I thank you to many members of the many member states for submitting statements for this open debate, and I welcome ministers and senior representatives from other countries on the Security Council. I'd like to start with a moment I'll never forget. In 1993, I visited a refugee camp in northern Uganda. It was my first ever visit to a refugee camp. When I arrived, it was overflowing with Sudanese refugees fleeing the civil war in Sudan. And I saw a 2-year-old. Her rib bones were poking out, and she was malnourished, so malnourished that she was unable to eat. And then in an instant, she died right in front of me. That moment and that little girl are seared in my memory. I remember her big, gaunt eyes. I remember her mother's eyes, too, when I saw nothing but darkness and despair. That day was the first time I truly understood what the words famine and acute malnutrition means. So when we use these technical terms, food security, acute malnutrition, conflict-induced hunger, let us not forget what they really mean. We're talking about raw humanity here. We're talking about pure suffering. We're talking about real people. We're talking about children and mothers like the ones that I met in 1993, more than 20 years ago. And the problem is compounded today. Acute malnutrition can trigger other risks like gender-based violence or the exploitation and abuse of children. In other words, the cruelty of hunger drives more cruelty. I wish that day in Uganda was the only time I saw that kind of cruelty up close, but it's not. The menace of hunger has been a repeated scene throughout my career, and I know many of you have seen it as well. 30 years later, I've never stopped thinking about what happened that day, how that nameless child's suffering was and still is entirely preventable. After all, in 2021, there are no reasons we can't get resources to people in acute need. In today's world, famine is man-made, and I use that gender deliberately. And if it is caused by us, that means it must be stopped by us too. In 2018, the Security Council took a powerful step toward addressing this inhumanity. We acted together. We spoke with one voice in Resolution 2417, which stated we would investigate bad actors who violate international law and use starvation as a weapon of war and hold them accountable. Last September, the Council was briefed on the status of conflict-driven hunger. The briefing painted a damning, if incomplete, portrait of the state of conflict-driven hunger around the world. In the 6 months since that briefing, the outlook for hunger and famine looks even worse, as you've heard from all of our speakers today. Why? Today's conflicts are lasting longer. They're growing more complex. And of course, COVID-19 and climate change have made a bleak situation even more dire. Here's what that means for vulnerable people around the globe. In Yemen, over 70% of the country needs food assistance, and over 2 million children under the age of 5 are at risk of starvation and acute malnutrition. And on my first day here at the UN, I spoke to humanitarian organizations on the ground in Yemen, and they shared how the country had been brought to its knees by 6 years of fighting, how they are desperate for consistent funding and support, and how their arrival efforts have been seriously hindered by the need to cross multiple lines of conflict. We're also alarmed by the situation in Ethiopia right now, as you heard from Ms. Beasley. Fighting in the Tigray region over the past 4 months has driven innocent citizens to the brink. Food stocks are depleted. Acute malnutrition is rising. The ongoing violence has prevented humanitarians from helping a desperately hungry people. Actors in Ethiopia, including Eritrean forces from across Ethiopia's borders, have restricted humanitarian access to the rural areas where the most Tigrayans live. We cannot allow this situation to deteriorate farther. We call on all sides, and I stress all sides, to stop the fighting and allow this man-made humanitarian situation to be addressed. Also, we need better, earlier, more consistent reporting on these crises. We need to ensure the Secretary General has the mandate and the tools to bring these emerging conflicts and potential starvation into the spotlight. I commend the Secretary General's announcement of the establishment of the high-level task force on preventing famine. And I would note that it's not just Yemen and Ethiopia, as the Secretary General and others noted. In Afghanistan, nearly half of the country's children under 5 are facing acute starvation. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, violence has led to displacement, which has led to 5 million acutely malnourished children. And I want to take this moment to express my condolences over the loss of life, to include the Italian ambassador and WFP staff. And in the Central African Republic, nearly 2 million face high levels of acute insecurity. May through August is the lean season, when food supplies run out. And in fact, people refer to it as the hungry season. If we want to help, now is the time. And finally, in South Sudan, violence has driven people off of their land, separating civilians, innocent civilians who are from their families. In their search for safety, innocent civilians are hiding in swamps where they barely survive off wild foods and contaminated river water. And part of what's so devastating about the crisis in South Sudan is the lack of data and reporting, which leads us to believe the situation is even worse than what we already know. There's only one reason we're being prevented from seeing the entire data set. South Sudan's government doesn't want us to know, which brings me to my last point. What's different today from when I visited the refugee camp in Uganda 30 years ago? Today, we should have better information on hunger is happening and where it will get worse. And we have seen major advances in therapeutic feeding for children suffering from acute malnutrition. We can save lives if we know where to go and if we put the funding toward it. And if we don't have the data, we can't deliver that life-saving assistance. That's a problem the Security Council can solve today, if we choose to. The body has the unique ability to demand and secure timely reporting, data, and action. So to that end, we asked Secretary General Guterres and his team for 2 formal reports to the Security Council each year, in addition to the current mandate to urgently notify the Council when there is a risk. We must depoliticize reporting and ensure that we have a regular mechanism for addressing these situations in the Security Council so that no more innocent civilians starve to death. We also asked the Secretary General to look specifically at how to enhance data collection and analysis methods. The United States is happy to be a partner in that effort, and we insist that the UN, as a matter of practice, work to analyze and identify who is responsible for hunger. After all, acute hunger is the callous weapon of warmonger. It is caused by people with names and faces, and the people who suffer at their hands deserve justice. It is my sincere hope that we can, as the Security Council, speak with one voice on this unifying issue. There's nothing we will do here that will bring justice to the little girl that I met all those years ago, or to her mother, or to the millions of others like them who have suffered needlessly and continue to suffer needlessly today. But it is within our power. It is within our power to honor their legacy. We can build a world where no one experiences extreme hunger, and we can start building that world today. Thank you. I assume my function as president of the council, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Eva Maria Lemets, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Estonia.
Madam President, distinguished briefers, dear colleagues, almost 3 years ago, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2417, which condemned the starving of civilians and unlawfully denying humanitarian access as a warfare. The resolution was conceived as a tool to break the vicious cycle of food insecurity, but it is we who must use this tool when required. Only that way can we put the resolution into practice and break the cycle of hunger. Compliance with international humanitarian law is of the highest importance in reducing food insecurity and preventing famine. Intentional starvation of civilians is a war crime. We welcome the amendments to the Rome Statute to include it as such. We call on state parties to take steps that would allow the amendments to enter into force quickly. Most of the food insecure people live in countries affected by armed conflicts. The intersecting drivers of food insecurity in conflict areas are complex, ranging from the conduct of hostilities and lack of humanitarian access to the broader drivers of risks such as climate change and the pandemic. While rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access is key during an acute food crisis, early action is of utmost importance. This is especially important for safeguarding child and maternal health. There are numerous cases on our agenda where we have seen an unlawful denial of humanitarian access. Moreover, various parties to conflict have raided and looted humanitarian aid storage sites and destroyed infrastructure that is indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Resolution 2417 helps us deal with such problems by allowing us to impose restrictive measures. We must not shy away from using these provisions on which we unanimously agreed. Dear colleagues, I would now like to highlight 3 critical cases. First, South Sudan. We have seen how the humanitarian situation there worsens on a yearly basis. About 70% of the people need humanitarian assistance, and if we do not act swiftly, we are edging closer to the sad example we see in Yemen. South Sudan's food security is in the worst state it has been since independence. That is why today I have the honor of announcing Estonia's contribution to the World Food Programme to mitigate the humanitarian situation there. Second, Ethiopia. Estonia is concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Tigray. We take note of the government's recent efforts to alleviate the situation. However, more needs to be done. Humanitarian community has made calls to increase the humanitarian assistance in order to avert famine-like conditions on the ground. To prevent the worst-case scenario, saving aid needs to be delivered to the people in need across the region, including in rural areas. It is critical that the Ethiopian government will fulfill its commitment to provide unfettered humanitarian access. We also call to the withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Tigray. Additionally, the growing number of credible reports of atrocities and human rights violations and abuses is extremely concerning. Independent investigations into reported human rights violations are an absolute must, and we acknowledge Ethiopia's announcements to that end. Third, Afghanistan. 40 years of war and the poverty coupled with a continuing drought means that 45% of the population is at risk of hunger this year. All signs show that the situation will further deteriorate. Nearly 1 in 2 children under 5 will face acute malnutrition. The stalled peace negotiations between the Taliban and Afghan officials and excessive levels of violence across the country not only keep people from securing their livelihoods, but also severely hamper the humanitarian aid from reaching those in need. In 2020, humanitarians faced 1,006 access constraints, more than double the incidents reported in 2019. Finally, it is also up to us, the members of the Security Council, to respond to potential famine in the world. I call on all of us to put the United Nations Security Council resolution into practice and convene on this pressing issue more often. This would allow for a more regular reporting and would thus help us prevent or mitigate future famines. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Lamette, for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Simon Coveney, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defence of Ireland.
We can't hear you, Minister. You're muted. Could you please check your microphone?
Can you hear me now, President? Yes, my apologies. Thank you, Madam President, and I'd like to extend my best wishes to you on your new role and also a powerful contribution today. Ireland deeply appreciates your leadership in dedicating the signature event of your presidency to the Council's responsibility to address the role that conflict is playing as the most significant factor in driving global hunger today. I'd also like to thank Secretary General Guterres for his remarks, and also David Beasley and Gabriela Bucher for their contributions, and of course for their organisation's important work. Madam President, my country, Ireland, has a historic memory of famine. The Irish famine was the worst humanitarian disaster of 19th century Europe. 1 million people perished, and another 1 million were forced to emigrate. This historical experience has left a legacy in Ireland. That legacy is our belief that we have a shared global responsibility to act, to protect populations. Famine is unconscionable. The use of hunger as a weapon of war is unconscionable. We have a collective responsibility, and this Council has a particular responsibility to see famine become a thing of the past. Madam President, I'll make 3 points today. First, it is undeniable that conflict is now the main driver of hunger. Too often, we have seen starvation used as a weapon of war. Every time the Council is briefed on Yemen and Syria, we are reminded that too many are facing death by hunger. This, in the 21st century, should be a cause of great shame. Just a few months ago, the UN released emergency funding to help stave off famine in 7 high-risk countries in which conflict is widespread. We cannot claim to be surprised. Conflict-induced hunger is a phenomenon that we around this Council table are briefed on time and time and time again. By the end of last year, an estimated 88 million people, the majority women and girls, were suffering acute hunger in countries where conflict and insecurity played the key role in driving that food insecurity. In Yemen, 24 million people are in receipt of humanitarian assistance. That's 24 individual human beings, the kind of children that we've heard about in the stories so far today. That conflict in Yemen means that the Yemeni people now face the real possibility of facing into the worst famine that the world has seen in many decades. In Ethiopia, even before the conflict in Tigray, we anticipated that 1.4 million people in that region would need food assistance in 2021. As we speak, and notwithstanding commitments made by the Ethiopian government, humanitarian access remains inadequate compared to the urgent large-scale needs that are there. Comprehensive assessment missions are not yet being permitted. An effective civil-military coordination system has yet to be properly facilitated to allow for the safe movement of humanitarian actors, some of them on this call. In Syria, 10 years into the conflict, 60% of the population and 80% of those in the northwest of the country face food insecurity. This in a country that ranked in the top half of the Human Development Index some 12 or 13 years ago. I visited Bab al-Hawa crossing last month, where emergency humanitarian aid is channeled to 2.7 million people in the Idlib area. Speaking to Syrian and international NGOs and UN agencies working in northwest Syria brought home to me again the sheer human misery and the utter waste of human potential that results from conflict. Madam President, the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2417 was an impressive moment in this Council's recent history. It was a testament to the Council's unity on the need to counter conflict-driven hunger. The resolution is a call to action. It restates core humanitarian principles. It demands the effective application of international humanitarian law and accountability for those who violate it. And it emphasizes the importance of humanitarian access to vulnerable populations. Resolution 2417 gives us the tools we need to tackle the issue of conflict and hunger. What we need is the collective political will to use those tools. Madam President, brings me to my second point. In spite of unanimous commitments by this Council, the intention of Resolution 2417 is not being realized for those most affected. We need to recognize that food security and armed conflict now has to be at the heart of the work of this Council. Conflict-induced hunger is not a rare or infrequent occurrence anymore. It calls for our close attention and prioritization. Conflict displaces people, destroys livelihoods, disrupts trade and the supply of food and agricultural inputs, damages infrastructure and reduces access to vital resources. This suffering is not limited to the most severe contexts. It affects millions of vulnerable people in many conflict contexts across the globe. Ireland is honoured to be working with Niger as the focal point on hunger and conflict on the Council for the next 2 years. We will host the first of the biannual briefings for 2021 next month to discuss the findings of the upcoming joint WFP-FAO report to Council members on this issue. We intend to keep a strong focus on hunger and conflict throughout our 2 years on the Council. Madam President, my third point is that we must adapt our approach to unique country contexts and acknowledge the different ways in which food systems are damaged by conflicts. In situations of armed conflict, the Council must be seized of the need to ensure the proper functioning of food systems and local markets. While rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access is vital during an acute food crisis, the Council must look at early action to prevent food insecurity and famine, especially to safeguard child and maternal health. Early warning and early action leads to prevention. Prevention saves lives, prevents misery, and saves money, and allows food systems to survive. Where there is a good reason to fear that food insecurity could be settling in, including by the deliberate denial of humanitarian access, this Council must act, and it must act quickly. Madam President, in closing, let us remember that the relationship between conflict and hunger is not new. War, by its very nature, disrupts food systems. In the worst scenarios, hunger is used as a brutal and medieval tactic, and one which is in direct contravention of international law. All parties to armed conflicts must comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, including in relation to humanitarian access. And those who fail to do so must be held fully accountable by this Council. Resolution 2417, unanimously adopted by this Council, demands no less. It is the responsibility of this Security Council to implement this resolution. It is our duty as UN member states to garner the political will to do so, and history will judge us harshly if we fail to do so. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Coveney, for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Rachel Amamo, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Kenya. Madam Secretary.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. And may I start by congratulating the United States of America on its assumption to the presidency of the Security Council for the month of March. I applaud the choice of conflict and food security as a focus of this debate. I also wish to thank the Secretary General and all the distinguished briefers for their illuminating remarks on this critical subject. Madam President, food security is the core human need. All other aspirations for development, security, and human progress rest on achieving it. This is why food security is one of the 4 policy priorities being pursued by the government of Kenya under what is popularly known as the Big 4 agenda. The drivers of our initiatives are ensuring food availability, increasing land under irrigation, scaling up smallholder production and value addition, ensuring affordability, and establishing 1,000 targeted production-level SMEs using a performance-based initiative model in the entire value chain. These interventions will deliver a paradigm shift that we believe will positively impact development, inclusion, cohesion, and sustained peace. However, we are doing this in the face of growing climate-related and environmental challenges in our region. Climate change and associated droughts, desertification, land degradation, and desert locust invasions are undermining food security and multiplying conflict threats. We are particularly concerned by food insecurity experienced in communities and areas where there's ongoing violent conflict. It is my hope that this debate will offer new or better ways to address food insecurity as a multiplier of peace and security fragilities and threats. I believe that many solutions will emerge on ensuring humanitarian access, linking humanitarian aid to national and local food production, and following the following 4 points are those that we would wish to make with the utmost brevity. First, we are of the view that there should be the insistence of the United Nations, regional organizations, and governments that civilian infrastructure that is critical to food delivery should never be deliberately targeted by conflicting parties. Similarly, food-related civilian objects, including farms, markets, water systems, mills, food processing and storage sites and hubs, should be protected as non-partisan resources that have no role in hostilities. Secondly, we submit that countries and regions experiencing armed conflict should do their utmost to provide and facilitate safe and unimpeded access by official humanitarian personnel to vulnerable civilians in need of aid in line with existing international and regional obligations. Third, humanitarian agencies should extend support not just to food aid, but also to building local capacities for producing food and boosting nutrition resilience. In this regard, support for farm inputs, seeds, and fertilizers to local populations in fragile countries is of utmost priority, as well as increasing funding to humanitarian agencies involved in this kind of work. Fourth and finally, is furthering compliance with Resolution 2417 in mitigating conflict-induced food insecurity, and particularly banning starvation as a weapon of war. Decisions and interventions of the Security Council should be based on facts and driven by empirical evidence to ensure a balanced approach to furthering international peace and security. As I conclude, I urge all of us to work together as we explore all available options to end hunger and conflict-induced food insecurity for the sake of all vulnerable populations and for international peace and security. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Omamo, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Daging Alstein, Minister for International Development of Norway.
Thank you so much, Madam President. As we meet, 700 million people in this world do not know where their next meal will come from. And as we heard, 270 million of them are facing acute food insecurity. If you try to imagine a room full of these people, what would they look like? Most would be women and young children. And if hunger had a face today, it would surely be female. And tomorrow it would probably be her child. But what would we say to them? I am afraid we would need to say that we heard the warning, but failed to agree on how to act. Investing in ending hunger today is also investing in preventing hunger tomorrow. People go hungry because they live in areas affected by endemic poverty, climate change, COVID-19, and most of all, conflict. Food security is security. In Resolution 2417, the world came together and recognized the link between armed conflict and hunger. It is time we shift the Council's focus from recognition to action. Let me therefore express my gratitude to the United States for organizing this debate. And let me also thank the Secretary General, David Beasley, and Gabriela Bucher for setting the stage. So, Madam President, nearly all the countries experiencing acute food insecurity are affected by conflict and armed violence. These countries will never eliminate hunger unless peaceful solutions are found. I am particularly concerned about two situations. In Yemen, the situation is desperate. If we do not act, this may become the worst famine the world has seen in decades. After 6 years of armed conflict, the civilian population has little resilience left. More than 16 million people are food insecure. Nearly 2.3 million children under the age of 5 are at risk of malnutrition. And this situation is first and foremost man-made, as we've heard. Only an inclusive, politically negotiated solution can bring this crisis to an end. This crisis, and the crisis in Ethiopia's Tigray, continues to deteriorate. There is widespread food insecurity and reports of starvation. Systematic looting and destruction of food, crops, and agricultural equipment is cause for great concern. As Undersecretary General Lowcock warned last week, if food does not get through and there is no agricultural revival, there is a possible risk of famine. Madam President, the Security Council must speak up with one voice against violations of international humanitarian law, including obstruction of humanitarian assistance or access and the use of starvation as civilian as a method of warfare. Accountability must be ensured. Our response to such violations could include imposing target sanctions where relevant and appropriate. We urge states parties to the ICC statute to ratify or accept the recent amendments concerning the war crime of starvation in non-international armed conflicts without delay. Those with influence over parties to armed conflict must demand that the parties abide by international humanitarian law, most hunger stems from politics. We need political will and political solutions. The Council and its members must follow up more firmly and consistently when the Secretary General activates the early warning mechanism in situation of risk of famine and widespread food insecurity. We welcome further discussions on how to achieve this. And the task force suggested by the Secretary General earlier today seems like a good way to proceed. The word famine should be enough to trigger alarm bells. Yet millions of people live under famine-like conditions or in areas where the lack of food over time is bringing devastation and death. But declaration of famine does not tell the whole story. As we all know, famine has never officially been declared in countries like Yemen, yet hunger is causing enormous humanitarian suffering. So protecting civilians must be at the core of all our interventions, with priority given to the most vulnerable. Lack of protection fuels conflict, displacement, and mistrust. Madam President, the Security Council has a charter-based mandate to prevent conflict by peaceful means. We must pursue all possible avenues, both in preventing conflicts and bringing them to an end. The importance of the entire UN system, including the World and the Food and Agriculture Organization, cannot be overstated in this context. We must build resilience in local communities so that they can better withstand crisis. We must take a more strategic approach as donors and test out smarter means of funding, making wider use of multi-year and multi-sector funding. We must act immediately when we hear early warnings, while at the same time continuing to work to remove the reasons for early warnings. So, Madam President, let me end. 700 million people depend on us, turning our words into action. The children in Yemen are crying out, crying for peace and food security. If we don't act now, it will be too late. Thank you so much, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency, Ms. Osteen, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Saboto Cesar, Minister of Agriculture, Forestry, Fisheries, Rural Transformation, Industry, and Labor of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, colleagues. Let me begin by conveying, on behalf of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, our appreciation to the United States of America for convening this timely discussion. We also thank our briefers for their insightful but very sobering remarks. Madam President, the fight against hunger remains one of the international community's most noble yet difficult endeavors. Decades of progress in the quest for global food security are being erased in the face of the worst global pandemic in over a century. Rampant climate change and ecological destruction, protracted conflicts, and other acute challenges, such as the desert locust infestation, we have to grapple with these. We can and we must do better to ensure that everyone, everywhere, has access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. For vulnerable and conflict-affected communities, including refugees, internally displaced persons, and those made stateless as a result of political, socio-economic, and environmental forces beyond their control, addressing hunger is more than a moral imperative. It is an existential concern. This challenge brings into closer focus the need for a comprehensive and coordinated whole-of-system approach to address the root and proximate causes of fragility and insecurity. The Security Council, as the primary body tasked with maintaining international peace and security, must spare no effort in our attempts to protect the most vulnerable, including by facilitating full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need. The Security Council must also work more closely with the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council to foster developmental solutions that meet the basic needs of people in conflict settings. The Peacebuilding Commission, with its strategic advisory capacities and its convening platform, is also useful in consolidating our efforts across the peace and security humanitarian developmental nexus. We must leverage these capacities more often. For our part, St. Vincent and the Grenadines has accelerated our efforts to provide food security throughout our nation and across our region. Even though we have been tried and tested by this pandemic, we have ensured that life, living, and production continue, and that we can feed ourselves and our neighbors. We are the breadbasket of the Southern Caribbean. Our farmers and fisherfolk remain crucial stakeholders to these efforts, and we will do what we must to support them as they continue to support us. In this regard, we reiterate our calls for urgent, concerted, and decisive action to tackle climate change, which is linked to food insecurity. The FAO, Oxfam, WPF must continue to play a very critical role. While we agree that conflict is a primary driver of hunger in some contexts, extreme weather events, including floods and droughts, also undermine agricultural productivity and create food insecurity. The continued suffering of our brothers and sisters in Haiti, one of the most food insecure countries in the entire world, is a painful reminder of the interlinkages between natural disasters, the political and economic instability. Greater efforts are therefore needed on all fronts to address the interconnecting challenges of conflict, climate change, and food insecurity. All parties to conflict and those with influence over them should heed our collective call for a global ceasefire. Global action must be accelerated to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, above pre-industrial levels. Emissions must be reduced, and financial commitments towards adaptation measures must be upheld. And major donors, including the international financial institutions, should scale up the assistance offered to developing and conflict-affected countries, including by expanding debt relief and concession funding. To conclude, Madam President, we underscore the need for inclusive multilateral solutions to advance the sustainable development agenda. If we are to make good on our collective promise to end hunger by 2030, we must work together. We have a shared global responsibility. Let us hold offenders accountable. I have hope of success. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Cesar, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Lord Tariq Ahmad of Wimbledon, Minister of State for the Commonwealth the United Nations and South Asia of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you also to the Secretary General, and may I put on record our thanks to both Mr. Beasley and Ms. Bucher for briefing us so comprehensively. As we've already heard from many colleagues on the Security Council today, it is undoubtedly a tragedy of epic proportions that here we are in 2021, here we are in the 21st century, that we still need to confront famine, and that our task, and let us be clear about that, is so much harder by those who pursue division, those who pursue conflict, and we must work together to address this immediate priority. And that is why, Madam President, the United Kingdom wholeheartedly welcomes the United States initiative to bring this vital issue of conflict and food security to the Council today. The situation is grave. There are no other words for it. Listening to your words, you talked of the raw humanity of the situation, the human suffering unfolding in front of us. I assure you that resonates with us all. Right now, famine is likely occurring in many parts of the world, but it's self-evident to us all in places such as South Sudan. In Yemen, more than 16 million people face a very, very like future in terms of starvation, likely death in the first half of this year, and as the Secretary General Guterres has warned us, rightly, that we are on the brink of the worst famine the world has seen in decades. For many of the countries on this Council's agenda, we know that conflict, as has been said this afternoon, is a primary driver of food insecurity and famine risk. We know that people affected by conflict are less able to source food and less able to buy it. We also know, tragically, that armed groups use starvation bluntly as a weapon of war and see humanitarian assistance as fuel for their enemy. They willfully disregard their obligations under international humanitarian law. They regard humanity as insignificant. We know that COVID and climate change compound this desperate situation. So this Council must redouble our efforts to break the cycle of armed conflict, which drives and sustains humanitarian crises around the world. And together, as the United Nations, we must do all we can to use the full range of tools at our disposal to prevent and end conflicts. UN Security Council Resolution 2417 focuses the Council's attention on conflict-induced food insecurity in countries both on and off our regular agenda. Many of us, as we've heard from colleagues today, many of us, including myself, the United Kingdom, most recently our Special Envoy on Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Affairs, have visited these countries directly. We've spoken to people about the brutal realities they face on a daily basis. Naming a few conflict situations or country situations. In South Sudan, where famine is likely to take root in Western people, 60% of the country's population face severe levels of food insecurity. Fundamentally, the government of South Sudan must do more to foster peace and stability and to de-escalate subnational conflict. And across the United Nations system, we need to work harder. We need to coordinate better if we are truly to remove the barriers that stop us getting food to those who need it. In northeast Nigeria, over a decade of conflict has left more than 1.2 million people unable to access basic humanitarian assistance. The horrifying recent attack by armed opposition groups in Dikwa that affected civilians and targeted humanitarian workers is frankly, utterly, and totally unacceptable. Attacks like these have made the food situation, the humanitarian situation, so much worse. and therefore we need to work together to improve humanitarian access on an urgent basis. As Mr. Beasley highlighted, indeed, Madam President, you yourself mentioned, across Ethiopia, around 18 million people will require humanitarian assistance in this year alone. In Tigray, humanitarian access remains hugely constrained. 4 months of violence has resulted in forced displacement, human rights violations, sexual violence allegations, and the collapse of essential basic services. The risks of extreme food insecurity are significant. An estimated 4.5 million people, 80% of the region's population, will need emergency aid over the coming months. Urgent action is needed to avert a major catastrophe. And these are just a few of the many tragic situations currently faced around the world. UN Security Council Resolution 2417 needs to be implemented more effectively. Colleagues, famine is not, as we've heard today, inevitable. In line with UN Security Council Resolution 2417, the United Kingdom stresses 3 immediate actions that we can take to prevent famine and the suffering caused by food insecurity. Firstly, we need to improve reporting and evidence of food insecurity and famine risk, including on who is blocking humanitarian access, and importantly, how they are blocking it. Reporting needs to be swift and timely so that this Council can take action before it is far too late. Secondly, this Council must act on the reporting it receives. Words are simply not enough. Despite the provisions in Resolution 2417, the Council has failed to encourage any independent state investigation into the use of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. And finally, and importantly, we also join the voices of those who say that the Council must hold to account those responsible for driving conflict-induced food insecurity, and that includes the use of sanctions against those who restrict humanitarian access. In conclusion, Madam President, conflict is escalating famine, and millions upon millions are suffering. If we are truly to prevent the starvation of more innocent women and men, and of course, tragically, children, it is vital that the UN reporting on these situations leads to Council action. We therefore welcome the announcement of the Famine Task Force today to more strongly coordinate the aid efforts on famine protection. And we therefore look forward to working together with all of you, our colleagues, our friends, our fellow Council members, and across the UN family of nations, to bring about the actions that can properly respond to the harrowing evidence we have heard today from our expert briefers. The question we often asked, why? Put simply, because it matters. Lives literally depend on it. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Lord Ahmed for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
I thank you, Madam President. Madam President, at outset, I thank the U.S. delegation for its initiative to convene this high-level meeting on food security. I also thank Secretary General Guterres, Executive Director Beasley, and Ms. Bucher for their briefings. The briefers showed us a disturbing picture of reality. Food security, rather than improved, has become a more serious problem. We still have a long way to go to accomplish the goal of zero hunger set in the 2030 Agenda. As the Secretary General pointed out, the food crisis, in particular acute in conflict-affected countries and regions in the Middle East and Africa, warranting high attention. We appreciate relevant countries' efforts in responding to the crisis. At the same time, with regard to the famine threat faced by some of the Middle East countries, African countries, the international community must take emergency actions, scale up the efforts to ensure adequate resources to make sure that the humanitarian assistance will enter the affected countries unhindered. And tailored actions need to be taken to alleviate the difficulties faced by women and children. China supports the UN agencies in accordance with the basic principles governing humanitarian assistance to engage and consult the affected countries, strengthen early warning, coordinate among international agencies for the use of humanitarian resources, and make a greater effort to address the famine threat faced by the affected countries. Meanwhile, addressing the some of the regional hunger problems and humanitarian issues, and very targeted actions should be taken to avoid the humanitarian, politicization of humanitarian issues. And China has provided and will continue to provide emergency food aid among other related assistance to the relevant countries through various channels to help them out and contribute to the alleviation of the sufferings of the affected people. Madam President, food security is nothing new. Armed conflicts, terrorist activities, natural disasters, extreme weather, global trade and supply chains, and commodity prices, all these factors could be the major triggers of food crisis. Meanwhile, fundamentally speaking, food security is a result of global development deficits and a reflection of inadequate and uneven development. Some countries and regions facing the constant and recurrent risk of famine are trapped in a vicious circle of non-development and armed conflict. Therefore, while focusing our attention on some pressing issues, we need to approach food security from a broader perspective, addressing both the symptoms and its root causes, and taking integrated measures within the framework of international peace and development. First, pushing for political solutions to hot-spot issues to create a conducive security environment for alleviating the food crisis in relevant countries and regions. Food security needs to be ensured throughout its cycle of production, storage, transportation, marketing, and distribution. Disruption in any of these stages by armed conflict, violence, and terrorism can lead to food security crisis. As long as conflicts and wars remain unresolved, people in conflict zones will continue to face food shortages. The international community should intensify efforts to facilitate political settlement of hotspot issues and create an environment of peace and security. It is necessary to urge all the parties to the conflict to respond to the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire and implement Security Council Resolution 2532. All the parties concerned should adhere to the principles of international law, such as respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries, non-interference in internal affairs, and non-use of force, and commit themselves to peaceful settlement of disputes. Second, holding sustainable development as the master key and helping the affected countries stand on their own in solving their food security problems. Emergency humanitarian aid can provide an immediate relief, but not a fundamental solution. In the final analysis, to achieve food security, it is crucial to address the affected countries' development problems related to agriculture, rural areas, and farmers according to local conditions, eliminate poverty, and revitalize rural areas. Humanitarian aid is very important, but not a substitute for development assistance. Developed countries should honor their commitment on development assistance in a timely manner, help developing countries build up their rural infrastructure, promote green and high-tech agriculture, and build up their capacity, meet the challenges posed by climate change, and continuously enhance the resilience and tenacity of their food systems. Farmers are the main actors in food production. All countries should heed their concerns, address their difficulties, and help them become the backbone of economic development and social stability. Over the years, China has consistently promoted South-South cooperation, bilaterally and multilaterally. By the end of 2019, with assistance from China, 24 agro-tech demonstration centers had been completed in Africa to pass on to African farmers and agro-technicians the agro-management expertise to improve their comprehensive agro-production capacity, benefiting 500,000 local people. The FAO China South-South Cooperation Program has achieved substantive results in several countries, directly benefiting over 70,000 farmers in 10 years. China will continue to share its own experience and practice and work with other parties to help developing countries eradicate poverty and solve food security problems. Third, strengthening international macroeconomic policy coordination and forming a strong synergy to ensure food security. The international community must strengthen coordination at the policy and operational levels to focus on and address the deep-rooted problems that have triggered food security crisis. First, the speculation of international capital on agricultural commodities, especially food, has triggered panic in the global market, driving up food prices across the board. Second, the agricultural subsidy policy of developed countries has seriously distorted the international market, which has in turn impacted on the market of developing countries and dampened enthusiasm of farmers in developing countries to produce food. Third, unilateral coercive measures and economic blockades have curbed agricultural development and trade cooperation. Only by solving these problems can the global food industry and supply chain be kept open and stable, and the food shortage, price distortion, and abnormal fluctuation caused by human factors be prevented. The UN needs to play a better role in coordinating and promoting multilateral cooperation. The G20 should accord higher priority to the promotion of agricultural development. The FAO, the WFP, and other UN agencies should continue to play a major role in strengthening coordination with the resident coordinators, among others, effectively allocating resources and helping the countries concerned strengthen capacity building in the food industry. Madam President, the eradication of poverty and hunger bears on the basic rights of the people. We have made significant progress, but we also have a long way to go. Under the impact of COVID-19, global food security is facing new challenges. According to the UN report, COVID-19 may cause an increase of 83 million to 132 million underfed people in the world. In November last year, President Xi Jinping made it clear when attending the 15th G20 summit that China supports the UN in holding the World Food Summit and that China proposes to convene an international conference on food loss and waste in due course. China has achieved the goal of lifting all the rural poor out of poverty under current standards. China looks forward to joining hands with the international community in solidarity and cooperation forging a strong synergy of global food security and making new contribution to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and to the achievement of common development. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Niger.
Madam President, I would like to thank you for having chosen during your presidency to shed light on a particularly important subject that draws a link between hunger and armed conflict. I would also like to thank Mr. António Guterres and Mr. David Beasley, as well as Ms. Gabriela Bucher, for their briefings on the latest developments in the food situation in conflict zones, as well as for their firm commitment to helping break the vicious cycle of conflict and its corollary, food insecurity. In this context, during our presidency of the Security Council in September 2020, my country, along with other members of the Council, co-organized a meeting on the subject of protecting civilians against hunger in the context of armed conflict, following a note published by OCHA on the question. 6 months after this debate, we are forced to note that the conclusions from that debate remain fully relevant, in that, as Mr. Beasley quite rightly noted in April 2020, we are heading towards a pandemic of hunger in addition to the current COVID-19 pandemic. Niger, the co-focal point with Ireland on hunger and armed conflict in the Security Council, will continue to work with all states that have an interest in this matter. In this regard, we welcome the fact that next month the Council will receive a briefing on the biannual joint FAO WFP report monitoring hunger in countries in armed conflict. It has now been established that conflict areas, due in particular to the displacement of persons that causes, mean that people who are in distress leave the areas where they are working and producing food, which exposes them to hunger and also exposes the host populations to hunger. Madam President, my country, Niger, in the Sahel region, is fully aware of the link between conflict and food insecurity, in that this region, which is already exposed to the scourge of terrorism, is among the worst affected by the harmful effects of climate change. The overlapping maps, therefore, of conflict zones and food insecurity is certainly not a coincidence for us. In the Sahel and in the Lake Chad Basin, where a large proportion of the population lives off aquaculture and where climate change is already exacerbating tensions, an acute food crisis has been amplified by terrorist armed attacks against the civilian population. The recent forecasts of specialized agencies show that 3.5 million people will face acute or severe food insecurity in the Lake Chad Basin. On top of this figure, 3.3 additional people need immediate assistance in Central Sahel. As well as these constraints, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated problems in these regions that were already faced by substantial humanitarian crises. Shortages of manpower are undermining the production and processing of crops. Upheaval due to breakdowns in the transport system and quarantine measures are preventing farmers accessing markets, and isolation and quarantine measures are preventing food assistance being delivered, or certainly making it harder to deliver it to the refugees and IDPs that need it at the local level. Madam President, the phenomenon of attacks and other barriers to humanitarian convoys are unacceptable. We call on all parties in conflict zones to authorize rapid and unfettered access to populations living in the territories under their control, and also for them to refrain from attacking, destroying, seizing, or spoiling food assistance and the infrastructure that is vital for the survival of the civilian population. Just as intolerable is discrimination experienced in access to assistance or the use of famine as a weapon of war. For that reason, my delegation would like to echo other members of the Council in firmly condemning these practices, which constitute a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law, the perpetrators of which should face the full force of the law. Madam President, aware of the link that exists between conflict situations and famine, in May 2018, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2417, and we hope that it will continue to guide our actions to break the cycle of hunger linked to conflict as quickly as possible. The interpreter notes that the video and audio feed has frozen. My delegation would like to say that the implementation of Resolution 2417 is essential and requires the implementation of an independent early warning mechanism based on data to allow for a rapid response to avoid the worsening of the situation. In this regard, my delegation would welcome regular reports from the Secretary-General on at-risk areas based on information provided by United Nations system actors or member states themselves. Any peace-building work should go hand in hand with investments in sustainable development. In many conflict-affected countries, the lion's share of the population depends on agriculture, and that is their livelihood. It is therefore essential that governments be provided with assistance in establishing an agricultural policy that is resilient to the impacts of climate change, including droughts, extreme weather phenomena, fires, invasive species, and floods. Lastly, breaking the vicious cycle between food insecurity and conflicts must also involve tangible action to put an end to the proliferation of weapons. Because the spread of weapons which inflict untold suffering on populations already affects people, including women. And my region, the Sahel, is one of the most telling examples of this. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Niger for his statement, and I now pass the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by congratulating you, Ambassador, and the US delegation for organizing this important open debate on conflict-induced food insecurity. I thank Secretary General António Guterres and the Executive Director of the WFP, David Beasley, for their briefings. I thank the Executive Director of Oxfam International, Ms. Gabriela Bucher, for bringing the civil society perspective. I start with paying tribute to all humanitarian, health, and aid workers for their assistance to people in need, especially in these challenging times of COVID-19. Madam President, Mahatma Gandhi once said, "There are people in the world so hungry that God can appear to them only in the form of bread." Food security is the basic minimum required, especially when we are accosted with such a devastating world crisis in the form of COVID-19 pandemic. The World Food Programme estimates that the number of people suffering from food insecurity is projected to more than double by the end of 2020 to 270 million people, with the COVID-19 pandemic making it worse. The Global Report on Food Crisis 2020 mentions that more than 77 million people are suffering from acute food insecurity in conflict-affected countries. While Resolution 2417 recognizes the link between armed conflict and conflict-induced food insecurity and the threat of famine, it is important to note that food insecurity is by itself not a sufficient condition for political violence and conflict. The link between the two is context and region-specific and varies according to the country's level of development, strength of its political institutions, and social safety nets. Fragile states generally have weak capacities to design, implement, and monitor policies and programs related to food, thereby increasing their vulnerability while facing a conflict situation. The solution for lack of food security is in conflict-affected states is therefore elsewhere. As such, conflict-induced food security issues should be taken up by the Council only in the context of specific countries where it may pose a threat to international peace and security. We are of the view that armed conflict and terrorism combined with extreme weather, crop pests, food price volatility, exclusion, and economic shocks can devastate any fragile state, leading to food insecurity and increased threat of famine. Armed groups have time and again resorted to scorched earth tactics and deliberately targeted civilian infrastructures such as land, farm animals, and water wells, which erode economic growth and development. Inability to fight locusts, for example, can affect an entire region and even further, and directly affect food security. Madam President, COVID-19 has only served to make food insecurity more complex by inter alia forcing countries to import restrictions on the movement of people, thereby depriving farm of hands to reap the harvest, resulting in loss of farm-based employment, limiting access to food in the rural areas, and eroding the ability of the state to cope with the socio-economic pressure of the pandemic. For the displaced, particularly women, children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities, the lack of access to dietary energy, clean water, and sanitation has had adverse nutrition and health implications. At the recently held intensive dialogue on the impact of conflict, climate change, COVID-19 nexus on Africa's food systems by FAO and AU, the experts agreed that building resilience to food-induced food insecurity calls for reshaping food systems to be more inclusive of poor and marginalized population. We are of the view that inclusive food systems that empower marginalized people by giving them a voice in local food policies will usher in a food-secured future. This would enable young people and women to find remunerative jobs, small farm holders to have access to agricultural markets, and adoption of climate-smart policies that promote seed diversity, innovation, and this. Madam President, civilians in conflict-affected areas need safe, uninhibited, and rapid access to basic services, and humanitarian workers need safe ways to ensure their teams and emergency sites can reach communities in need. For example, in northeast Nigeria, thousands of people are trapped without life-saving humanitarian assistance. In Yemen, restrictions on land, sea, and air trade routes have led to severe cuts of vital supplies of commodities such as food, fuel, and medicines. In Mali, counterterrorism measures limit civilian access to humanitarian aid. The 10-year-long conflict in Syria has adversely affected food security, putting millions of Syrians to risk. Unilateral measures can only make these situations worse. The UN and member states must make ensuring access a priority by engaging with national and regional authorities. While all humanitarian action must be primarily guided by the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, we are unfortunately witnessing an increasing tendency to politicize humanitarian situations. We need to resist the trend of assistance in the political process. Such a position by donors will only in conflict situations. There is an urgent need for the donor community to scale up assistance to conflict-affected countries and to ensure that humanitarian agencies receive the necessary funding to fully execute their plans without politicization of the basic needs of the people. Madam President, the global community has a moral obligation to act in situations where there are credible reasons to believe that millions of people are in desperate needs of assistance. Food assistance alone surely cannot be a long-term sustainable solution to food insecurity. Promoting peace and stability and development is paramount and must include livelihood support, social protection programs, and community-based approaches, including investment in agriculture, infrastructure, and capacity building in rural development, especially in conflict areas. This calls for a multi-stakeholder approach that is coherent and devoid of politics. India stands ready to support all such efforts. At the onset of the COVID pandemic, India enacted a series of measures nationally to augment its food security and to emerge from the crisis much more resilient. These include developing the Indian digital ecosystem for agriculture as a modular, interoperable digital platform that aims to improve the welfare and income of farmers, increase productivity and efficiency in agriculture and allied sectors, and unlock new opportunities for innovation. With a view to encourage use of modern technologies in agriculture, the guidelines of the National E-Governance Plan in Agriculture were revised in June 2020 by providing support for projects involving use of modern information technologies. The creation of a national database for farmers that already covers over 50 million farmers is also being taken up as a priority. India remains strongly committed to the cause of global food security and over the last several years contributed to UN's Central Emergency Response Fund and the UNOCHA in response to several humanitarian crises. Further, India has always stepped forward to extend aid amounting to millions of tons of food grains to several vulnerable countries across the world. In 2019 alone, the WFP sourced approximately 11,000 metric tons of pulses, sorghum, wheat, and rice from India to assist vulnerable populations. More recently, in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, India has provided food aid in the form of thousands of metric tons of wheat, rice, pulses, and lentils to several countries across the world, including Myanmar, Maldives, Afghanistan, Djibouti, Eritrea, Lebanon, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Sudan, South Sudan, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and many others to strengthen their food security in these challenging times. As recently as last month, India gifted 2,000 metric tons of rice to Syria. And even as I speak, a ship is en route now from India to deliver 1,000 metric tons each of food aid to Madagascar and Comoros. We remain committed to providing assistance to all vulnerable countries to support them in their quest for food security. Our spearheading the adoption of the resolution for declaring 2023 as the International Year of Millets is in this direction. We are equally committed to providing vaccines to the world so that we can tackle COVID and food insecurity at the same time. I would like to conclude by citing a quote from the Indian scriptures which says, Annam Brahma, that is, food is God. Let us resolve to collectively work together in ensuring that no one has to be ever devoid of food. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I now turn the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me at the outset to thank the United States of America for choosing this vital topic for our debate today. Voice is breaking. The interpreter apologizes. The voice is gone.
Do you hear me, Madam President? كما أشكر السيد الأمين العام والمدير التنفيذي
Allow me to thank the Secretary General and the Executive Director of Oxfam International and the Executive Director of the World Food Programme for their valuable briefings. We have listened with great concern to the scary numbers provided in the briefings, which clearly indicate the growing risk of famine and food insecurity, and the threat they represent to millions of people stuck in areas of conflict and violence. Madam President, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2417 in 2018, recognizing the direct link between armed conflict and violence on one side and food insecurity and famine risks on the other. It stressed the importance of ensuring the unimpeded and safe access of humanitarian assistance to civilians in conflict areas. Despite the growing attention given by the Security Council to this issue, we have recently witnessed a scary increase in the number of people on the verge of famine in conflict areas, such as Yemen, South Sudan, and other countries, where the acute lack of food threatens the lives of millions, especially women and children, and causes malnutrition and diseases. This is happening more and more as conflicts continue to rage. Today, more than 270 million people are on the brink of famine, according to the World Food Programme. As COVID-19 spreads, the dangerous humanitarian consequences of conflicts, mainly famine, are threatening people stuck in conflict areas, especially if the vaccination of vulnerable people stalls. Moreover, climate change in a number of conflict regions has become the main reason behind resource scarcity, causing more than just violence and hostilities. This is threatening food security, an issue discussed by our Council on many occasions. Addressing its consequences requires more cooperation and a more effective approach. All these factors exacerbate famine in conflict areas. However, we must not forget that starvation is used as a weapon of war in a number of conflicts, and it is impeding the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We condemn and reject this practice as a blatant violation of human rights and a further complicator of crises. This may amount to a war crime. For this reason, the international community should intensify its efforts to prevent the use and targeting of civilians during conflict. It must take all necessary measures, including criminal measures, to ensure all parties comply with the international humanitarian law. Madam President, ongoing armed conflicts continue to represent the main and direct reason behind the risk of famine and food insecurity. They are a major impediment to an effective humanitarian response. We cannot end famine and human suffering if we do not silence the guns and break the vicious cycle of conflict, violence, and food insecurity. The Security Council bears the main responsibility of maintaining international peace and security. It plays a role in ending conflicts, especially protracted conflicts, by pushing for peaceful political solutions and implementing its relevant resolutions. We reaffirm the need for the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2532 of 2020, and we support the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, unimpeded safe access of humanitarian assistance to people in need, and the protection of humanitarian workers. In conclusion, the international community, especially the Security Council, must shoulder their responsibility before it is too late. It is unacceptable under any condition for children, women, and men to die of hunger in areas of conflict and violence. To prevent humanitarian catastrophes, we must support the joint, coordinated efforts of UN and regional humanitarian agencies. We must promote international cooperation and solidarity, strengthen our humanitarian response, and increase the capacities of relevant states to protect civilians. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Tunisia. I now call on the representative of France.
Madam President, I thank the Secretary General, the Director of Oxfam International, and the Executive Director of the World Food Programme for their briefings. The figures that you just shared speak for themselves. The risk of famine and acute food crises is worsening daily. Conflicts, climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the ensuing economic recession contribute to the daily rise in the number of persons facing severe food crises. And I'm thinking here in particular of Yemen, South Sudan, and Nigeria. But I'm also thinking of the Sahel region and especially Burkina Faso, where the situation is still particularly worrying. I'm also thinking of the region of Tigray in Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We have a collective responsibility and a moral obligation to prevent such a tragedy, and only collective, coordinated, and integrated action will make it possible to avert a humanitarian disaster. States, UN agencies, regional and sub-regional organizations and NGOs, but also the private sector and international financial institutions must be mobilized to stave off the risk of famine and, more broadly, of food crises. We must first strengthen the prevention and early warning mechanisms to better anticipate, prevent, and mitigate the effects of these crises. It is essential that we strengthen national and local productive systems and promote social safety nets that will help the most vulnerable provide for their own food needs, and this can only come through enhanced cooperation between humanitarian and development actors. France will continue through its bilateral and multilateral support to work towards this. Our financing of food aid was increased by 51% in 2 years to total over 50 million euros in 2020. This figure will continue to grow this year to total over 72 million euros, which is an increase of 43% compared with last year. The French Development Agency has earmarked in 2020 $1 billion for agriculture, rural development, and biodiversity. We can never say it enough. Conflicts are the main driver of the risk of famine and food crises, and it is essential that we step up implementation of resolutions 2532 and 2565 on COVID-19 through a ceasefire and a humanitarian pause. Preventing famine and food crises also requires all parties to the conflict to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law. It is unacceptable that IHL would be flouted each day. The protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is critical. The use of starvation as a weapon of warfare against civilians is a war crime that should not go unpunished. France condemns the rise in attacks against humanitarian and medical personnel and the many obstacles preventing safe access for people in need. And I'm thinking in particular of Yemen and Tigray rather, and Yemen, where we call for tangible progress on the humanitarian front. Although conflicts remain the main drivers of food crises, we must step up our efforts to find lasting political solutions to this conflict. You can count on the unfailing and ongoing support of France, Madam President. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now turn the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
I thank Madam President, and at the outset, I would like to thank the United States presidency for convening this very timely debate. I would like to thank Secretary General António Guterres, Mr. Beasley, and Ms. Bucher for their insightful briefing. Madam President, since the last Council discussion on the same topic just 6 months ago, food insecurity in several conflict situations have gravely deteriorated. Famine have loomed large in Yemen, South Sudan, Northeast Nigeria, and DRC, and Burkina Faso. The number of people suffering from acute food insecurity in conflict situations have increased by 20% in the last 2 years. The humanitarian situation have been further compounded by economic impact of COVID-19, adverse effect of climate change, and the proliferation of diverse locusts. The vicious circles between armed conflict and conflict-induced hunger was widely recognized, and it is high time for the Council renews efforts to break this vicious circle, to deliver on its commitment to maintain and build peace. In this regard, allow me to highlight the following point. First, Respect for international humanitarian law is a must in all situations of armed conflict. Starvation must never be used as a matter of war. We call on all parties to armed conflict to comply with their obligation to respect and protect civilian and civilian objects, including objects necessary for food production and distribution. Civilian population must not be deprived of humanitarian assistance and objects indispensable for their survival. Women and children and the most vulnerable are disproportionately affected by armed conflict. Their special needs should be factors in our response. We reiterate the call on all parties to armed conflict to adhere to the Security Council demand for an immediate cessation of hostility to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. We pay high regards for the tireless effort of UN agencies, the FL, the WFP, and donors in combating hunger in an armed conflict situation. There is a strong imperative to ensure unhindered access for impartial humanitarian workers and guarantee their safety and security. Second, international cooperation is crucial in enhancing government capacity to protect and meet the basic need for their civilian and prevent famine, while respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity of affected states. As was emphasized by the briefers and other council members, there is an urgent need to further strengthen the global humanitarian response in funding and in kind, as well as in logistic preparedness, so that humanitarian agencies can receive necessary support to continue their life-saving work. We must advance a comprehensive and long-term strategy which aims at supporting local community to build resilient food system, enhance adaptation and sustenance, guarantee availability and accessibility of food and other essential services. Local humanitarian organizations should be supported and engaged in order to alleviate the strength of international humanitarian system. Third, the most effective way to end hunger is to end and resolve conflict and build peace. The Council should continue with an integrated approach in addressing root causes of conflict, such as poverty, injustice, militarism, and disregard of international law. A home of system approach is crucial for the UN to deliver its promise of sustainable peace and development. The instrumental role of regional organizations cannot be overstated. Let me conclude, Madam President, by emphasizing Vietnam's priority for the protection of civilians in armed conflict. We call on all countries and partners to show strong, renewed solidarity and humanity so as to ensure accessible, safe, nutritious food for all, especially for the most vulnerable population. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement. I now turn the floor to the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we thank the briefers, the Secretary General David Beasley and Gabriela Bucher, for their analysis of the situation of food security. Madam President, since this is your first presidency and its first signature event, we can see in the choice of such an acute theme for our meeting an important signal of your support for more active joint work to resolve the problems of food security. For our part, we note that for our delegation as well, strengthening the cooperation of UN member countries in this area is a priority. Growing socio-economic challenges linked to the eradication of poverty, the fight against hunger, climate change, and migration require the collective efforts of the entire international community. Without unified action and mutual trust, we cannot expect to effectively achieve the ambitious Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, we believe that to achieve the desired result, we must avoid the Security Council beginning to interfere in the well-oiled and effective work on this subject done by the General Assembly and also the specialized organs of the UN that are responsible for food security and the fight against hunger. We would in particular like to single out the WFP and the FAO. The World Food Programme's contribution to resolving the acute problem of food shortages in countries with a complex military and political situation is hard to overstate. We regret the fact that no space could be found among the briefers for a representative of the FAO, because after all, the FAO is the leading UN specialized agency in agriculture and food, and a knowledge organization with a unique methodological ability to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the food security situation. Alongside the WFP, it works to analyze the relevant risks. And both organizations head the UN Humanitarian Cluster on Food Security. Madam President, the real, thorough and fruitful work on increasing the coordination of international action in this area, as I already said, is done in the specialized agencies, the WFP and the FAO in Rome, as well as in other organs in the economic sphere. We are not entirely convinced that involving the Council in this work will provide any added value. We therefore oppose the idea of appointing a focal point for monitoring the implementation of Resolution 2417 of the Security Council. This would only muddy the waters of the work being done by the UN agencies in Rome. This position does not mean that we do not consider these issues and also the problem of hunger to be important. We do not deny that in individual, regional, and country-specific contexts, the issues of climate change, hunger, and migration may serve as additional factors that increase the risk of conflict. However, these phenomena should be analyzed as they apply to each specific situation. Speaking about this in generic terms and in a global context is not justified, and imposing a universal approach to this interconnectivity could even be dangerous. What's more, far from all conflicts represent a threat to international peace and security, which is the Council's purview, and not all countries where there is hunger are in conflict. We also do not agree with shifting the focus onto conflicts which overshadows other root causes of hunger. These include the opportunistic actions of a number of countries that exacerbate internal political crises. By some strange coincidence, the tragedy of hunger grips precisely those territories where state institutions have been destroyed. That is what exacerbates conflicts and increases the risk for national food security. An example of this is what we see in Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia.
Do we have translation?
We seem to have lost the translation. Can the interpreter switch?
Нам необходимо извлекать уроки. I think we lost translation, I'm afraid. Can the interpreter...
The French interpreter stating that the sound from the speaker has been interrupted.
SCAD on? SCAD, can you check to see where the
Repeat, there is no sound currently coming from the speaker.
Yes.
Could SCAD please check the sound connection with the Russian ambassador?
Hear me now.
Yes, I think you see, Ambassador. Please continue.
I will repeat the last paragraph. Не согласны мы и со смещением... Есть перевод? Do you hear my voice?
Yes, we hear the English. Can the interpreters hear? Can we have confirmation, please?
The interpreter is not with us at this moment.
We did not hear the interpretation.
Ну что?
Please stand by for a moment while we check the status of the interpreter.
Can I continue to hear me? Okay, good. Не согласны мы и со смещением акцентов на конфликты.
We do not agree with so much emphasis to be put on conflict and to overlook the other root causes of conflict, including the dangerous adventures of many countries that have led to the worsening of intrapolitical crises, such as, for instance, the tragedy of hunger also affects areas in which state infrastructure have been destroyed. And that indeed is what worsens conflicts and increases the risks of national food insecurity. Clear proof of this is what we see day after day in Iraq, Syria, or even in Somalia, among other cases. And Yemen is particularly characteristic of this. Here it isn't hunger that led to conflict, but rather conflict that we also need to learn lessons from this situation, and this is how we will significantly reduce the number of humanitarian disasters. Madam President, attempts to involve those affected by hunger from armed conflict on the Security Council's agenda go hand in hand with attempts to change certain concepts and to draw up unfounded links between certain other subjects, and that is concerning to us. We do not agree with drawing a link between the issue of food insecurity and protection, and we are being asked to carry out humanitarian activities in the same vein by condemning states that take time to send data on these issues. We interfere in their domestic affairs. This cooperation must be done on a certain basis and should not be hampered by conditions. Security Council depends on the respect for humanitarian law and the strengthening of the humanitarian nature of assistance. The resilience of agricultural production systems in the light of climate change depends on climate change, sustainable development, and does not have a direct link with the activities of the Security Council. In light of this, we do not deem it necessary to oblige the Secretary General to report twice a year to the Security Council on food security and on fresh situations of crises linked to armed conflicts. It has had this mandate since 2018, during which Resolution 2417 was adopted. Nothing prevents it for him from reporting to the Security Council on individual countries or on specific countries struck by famine. Madam President, turning now to the substance of the subject pertaining to us today, we wish to underscore that capacity building at a local level, establishing markets for commodities, liberalizing exchange markets, and also drawing lessons from natural disasters could help us in helping economies destroyed by these situations. It's important also to counter the root causes of these problems and lift unilateral sanctions. In this regard, we welcome the recently taken decision by the new American government to modify the sanctions imposed against Ansar Allah. Without that, the situation in Yemen, and particularly famine, would have reached a point of no return. The Russian Federation agrees in the need to react quickly to the problem of famine. But this must be done in the context of mechanisms that address this matter professionally and that bear in mind the complex nature of the challenges faced by countries in the area of sustainable development. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for his statement, and I now turn the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mexico is grateful for the convening by the United States to this debate on the impact of armed conflicts on famines and food security, which represents an opportunity to advance on a critical issue, which, as has been stated here, urgently requires our unified and collective decisiveness. The briefings that we have heard from such high-ranking officials enrich our perspectives, and the reports from the executive directors of Oxfam and the World Food Programme leave us in no doubt. This is a very serious crisis, and it is urgent for this Council to act accordingly. Armed conflict is the most significant cause of famine and the rise in food insecurity. We have already heard the figures from the World Food Programme. In the interest of time, I shall not dwell on them. We must therefore begin by recognizing out loud that food insecurity, just like famine, is exacerbated exponentially in situations of armed conflict. Problems in food production, processing, and distribution, as well as unequal access to food, escalate economic hardships and social disparities, and trigger situations of violence in fragile contexts and even in less fragile contexts. Security Council Resolution 2417 represented an important step in recognizing the links between conflicts and food insecurity. But as we have seen, recognizing it is not sufficient for resolving it. Food security is vital to conflict prevention. The reduction of hunger and malnutrition is necessary for social cohesion and for stability, as well as for peace. And all of this represents a crucial aspect in the post-conflict phase. They are essential to ensuring a fair and equitable reconstruction. Food insecurity, currently worsened by the pandemic, also disproportionately affects women and girls. According to the FAO, in low-resource countries, women represent 48% of the labor force in agriculture. But they have less access than men to practically all forms of support. This again is another powerful reason for the empowerment of women and girls if we truly want to eradicate hunger. Madam President, although on a different scale, it remains worrying that in the face of natural disasters resulting from the climate crisis, which is also incumbent on us, food chains are also affected, even temporarily, and this could generate serious situations of food insecurity in all regions of the world, including Latin America and the Caribbean. In sum, we are facing a situation that requires our immediate attention. Famine and food insecurity are central issues on the international peace and security agenda. Mexico underscores that, in accordance with the Rome Statute, deprivation of access to food constitutes a crime against humanity. Hence why we categorically condemn its use as a method of warfare. It is simply inadmissible. The Security Council must play a decisive role in ensuring that the parties involved in armed conflicts respect international humanitarian law and ensure unhindered access by the civilian population to humanitarian assistance. In this regard, we once again condemn, and do so in the strongest terms, the attack on the World Food Programme convoy in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in which the Italian ambassador, a Carabinieri police officer, and an official from the programme were killed. Our condolences go to their relatives. In accordance with Resolution 2417, the Council can and must continue to work to ensure that its decisions are grounded in the most relevant and current information from the field. We need reliable and timely data, as has been stated here. For this reason, we believe that the early warning systems of the Council and the UN as a whole must also be strengthened. Effective prevention to avoid famine is the ethical imperative incumbent on us all. We welcome the Secretary General's initiatives on a task force on preventing famine and his initiative to convene a summit without any exclusions on food systems. Indeed, pragmatic and proactive initiatives are required. Madam President, Mexico recognizes your leadership, and we echo those voices that are calling on the Security Council to strengthen all of its actions aimed at comprehensively addressing the multiple triggers of conflicts, including, and alarmingly so, food insecurity. Thank you very much.
The representative of Mexico for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. Before closing, I would like to thank once again the Secretary General, Mr. Beasley, and Ms. Bucher, and all of the distinguished participants who joined us today. I would also like to thank the member states and regional groups which have so far submitted written statements on the subjects of today's discussion. Statements that are received by the end of the day will form part of the compilation of statements from this meeting, and we look forward to receiving them. The meeting is adjourned.